Between the sword and the armor, the kingdom in destruction. From early on I learned that there is a fundamental difference between strength and rigidity, although from a distance both wear the same expression of firmness. The sword, when raised, demands resolve, but it also requires an understanding of timing, of restraint, of when not to strike. The armor, when worn, promises safety, but it extracts its cost slowly through weight, heat, and the quiet erosion of movement. For a long time I watched people mistake one for the other, believing survival to be a matter of enduring rather than adapting, as if standing still were proof of virtue. The kingdom I speak of is not confined to borders, banners, or stone walls. It exists wherever decisions accumulate, where habits harden, where silence is chosen either with wisdom or with fear. Its destruction never begins with fire or invasion. It begins with posture. It begins when the sword is lifted to protect pride instead of life, and when the armor is worn not to face danger, but to avoid feeling. Collapse rarely announces itself. It seeps into routine, hides in excess precaution, and in the refusal to move when movement is required. I have lived long enough to see that every declining kingdom falls in love with its own idea of security. Walls grow thicker, rules more intricate, language more ceremonial, while life itself, indifferent to structure, looks for exits. The ruler who fears losing control tightens his grip, not noticing that the road has changed and that what once responded to force now requires balance. Destruction at that point is not an event but an accumulation of fatigue, a slow erosion of trust between thought and action. There is no greater tragedy than one built from good intentions reinforced by blind discipline. The sword dulls when it is used only to reaffirm authority. The armor rusts when it is never removed. Between them lies a narrow, almost invisible space where clarity should reside. Few remain there for long because it demands attention without reward and humility without applause. It is easier to choose an extreme, to pledge loyalty either to force or to defense, and to call that loyalty virtue. The kingdom in destruction is the one that no longer tolerates this middle ground, this interval where silence teaches more than the noise of certainty. Over the years, I have seen victories that quietly prepared far greater defeats, and retreats that preserved entire generations. History, when read without vanity, reveals that empires do not fall for lack of weapons, but from excess weight. Traditions left unquestioned become burdens. Promises forged for another era lose their relevance. Identities hardened beyond necessity stop reflecting the living world they claim to protect. The man who believes himself to be armor forgets his own body. The one who sees himself only as a sword eventually wounds everything he touches, including himself. There is a particular solitude that accompanies those who live between these symbols, because they do not belong to the enthusiasm of conquerors nor to the comfort of the sheltered. Yet this solitude is fertile. From it grows the ability to observe without urgency, to act without spectacle, to accept that not every answer must arrive immediately. A living kingdom is one that respects this slowness, this refusal to turn every threat into war and every fear into a wall. But kingdoms, like people, rarely choose sobriety when pressure increases. They prefer simple narratives, clear enemies, rapid solutions. At that point, destruction becomes almost unavoidable, not because alternatives are absent, but because no one is willing to inhabit them. I learned, perhaps too late, that maturity is not a process of hardening, but of knowing when to bend without breaking. True discipline does not shout, does not display itself, does not ask to be recognized. It reveals itself in the consistency of small gestures, in the ability to sustain a decision even when no one is watching. A disciplined kingdom is not one that controls everything, but one that trusts enough to allow movement. Between the sword and the armor, there is a living body, vulnerable, aware that it cannot win every battle nor deflect every blow. To deny this vulnerability is the first step toward ruin. Many label as weakness what is in fact lucidity. The recognition of one's own limits does not diminish a kingdom. It prevents it from expanding beyond what it can sustain. Destruction begins when expansion becomes an end in itself, when growth matters more than integrity, I have seen leaders accumulate territory while losing the quiet respect of those closest to them. I have seen cities shine outwardly while rotting inwardly, held together only by fear and the appearance of order. The sword gleamed, the armor was intact, yet the kingdom had already fractured into invisible pieces. There is something profoundly human in this recurring pattern, in this difficulty of accepting that permanence demands more wisdom than conquest. Time, that indifferent judge, is unimpressed by displays of power. It observes coherence between intention and gesture, between speech and practice. Where that coherence fails, time works against you in silence. The kingdom in destruction is the one that cannot hear its own signs of wear, that mistakes criticism for betrayal and silence for loyalty. In my experience, the most dangerous silence is not that of contemplation, but that of resignation. When people stop speaking not by choice but by exhaustion, the fall has already begun. Between the sword and the armor, there should be room for measured speech, for disagreement that does not seek humiliation, for doubt that does not paralyze. Without this space, what remains is the mechanical repetition of empty gestures, a performance of strength in which no one fully believes. I do not write these lines to warn or persuade, because every kingdom must encounter its own limits. I write because understanding is not the same as intervening, and there is intrinsic value in naming what one observes, even if nothing changes. Honest contemplation is not escape, but a way of remaining whole while the surroundings fragment. Between the sword and the armor, I chose to learn how to breathe, not out of cowardice, but because breath sustains both attack and defense. A kingdom that forgets how to breathe becomes rigid, anxious, predictable. Its destruction will not be dramatic, only inevitable. When it finally collapses, many will say it was sudden, that no one could have foreseen it. But those who lived attentively will have watched the collapse take shape slowly in small excesses, in small omissions, in the inability to remain in the middle, where life, despite everything, continues to pulse.